July 27th, 1890. A wheat field outside of Auvers-sur-Oise, France, Vincent van Gogh, potentially one of the greatest artists who ever lived, lies bleeding on the ground with a bullet in his stomach. Hours later, he staggers back to his tiny attic room at the Revolver Inn. His last words to police: "Do not accuse anybody. It is I that wish to commit suicide." 2 days later, he's dead. His brother Theo holds him as he takes his final breath. Case closed. Well, the tragic suicide of a tortured genius, but 121 years later, 2 Pulitzer Prize-winning biographers would uncover evidence that shatters just about everything we thought we knew. Evidence of teenage bullies, a malfunctioning gun, and a protective lie that would become one of art history's greatest cover-ups. Now, I do have to say I did do a short video on this last year, but it's a story I keep coming back to because it illustrates so much on how we think we know certain stories, mostly because they're repeated so often that it kind of morphs into being true. And I think this is what happened with most of what we know about Van Gogh. Not to mention there is a whole museum that is invested on the story never changing. But I mean, that's a completely different conversation. So for now, let's dive in.
Oh yeah, I know this one. I know this one.
Vincent van Gogh. I mean, the name alone conjures images of swirling skies, brilliant sunflowers, and honestly, a man consumed by his own genius. He was born in the Netherlands in 1853, and he didn't start painting until he was 27 years old. But in just 10 years, he would create over 2,100 works of art. Masterpieces that many would say, revolutionized modern art and eventually would sell for hundreds of millions of dollars. The tragedy to all this is he sold exactly one painting during his lifetime for about 400 francs, about $2,000 in today's money. And the legend says he was mad, unstable, dangerous even to himself. In December of 1888, he severed part of his own ear during a psychotic episode. And there's questions today whether or not that's actually true or accurate. Many historians believe it was his friend, Paul, who may have done the ear cutting in a violent argument. He committed himself to an asylum in Saint Remy de Provence, where he painted most of his famous works, including The Starry Night. He was battling what doctors today believed was epilepsy or maybe bipolar disorder or potentially both. But in May 1890, he seemed to be recovering. His letters that he wrote to his brother Theo were hopeful. They were optimistic even. And he moved to Auvers-sur-Oise, a picturesque village just north of Paris, to be closer to Theo and under the care of a doctor named Dr. Gachet. He was a homeopathic physician who treated artists. He rented a tiny attic room at the Revolver Inn for 3 francs 50 a day. Room number 5, 7 feet wide, a single bed, a chair, and a window overlooking wheat fields. But then, something happened. Van Gogh exploded with creativity. In just 70 days, he completed over 75 paintings, nearly one per day. Works bursting with color and life. The church at Auvers, portrait of Dr. Gachet, wheat field with cypresses. These aren't the paintings of a suicidal man. They're the work of, an artist who's finally finding his voice, an artist with plans for the future. And just days before his death, he placed a large order for fresh paints and canvases. So to every account, he was planning his next works, writing optimistic letters to Theo. And then on the evening of July 27th, 1890, everything changed. According to the story we've been told for over a century now, this is what happened. Vincent walked into a wheat field behind the Chateau d'Auvers. Sorry for my pronunciation. He brought his easel, his paints, his brushes. He was going to paint, but instead, somehow, he obtained a gun, a Naifeh revolver, and in the field, he shot himself in the chest. Not in the head like 90% of suicide victims, in the stomach, at an angle. Severely wounded but still conscious, he somehow gathered his belongings, except the gun, of course, and he walked nearly a kilometer back to the Revolver Inn. He climbed the narrow stairs to his attic room, laid down on his bed, and waited. The innkeeper, Gustave Revaux, found him around 9 p.m., bleeding and in agony. Van Gogh supposedly told him, "I wounded myself in the fields. I wanted to kill myself." Dr. Gachet was called, then a secondary doctor, Dr. Mazarin. They examined the wound but decided the bullet was too deep to actually be able to remove it, and that there was nothing that they could do except for wait. This is whenever they sent a telegram to Theo in Paris. He arrived the next morning and sat with his brother for hours. And Vincent van Gogh died at about 1:30 a.m. on July 29th of 1890, 30 hours after being shot. According to Theo, his last words, at least in English, were, "The sadness will last forever." Vincent was buried in a simple ceremony with his paintings covering the walls of the cafe where mourners gathered. The police did investigate briefly, but there was no extensive report, no real true crime scene investigation or anything like that. The case was closed almost immediately. Suicide. End of story. Well, except it really isn't. The suicide narrative went unchallenged for about a century. It fit perfectly with the myth of the tortured artist, the mad genius who couldn't handle the weight of his own, brilliance. Irving Stone's 1934 novel, Lust for Life, really cemented the story. When it became a movie starring Kirk Douglas in 1956, the suicide became essentially a cultural fact. But in 2011, two American biographers, Stephen Naifeh and Gregory White Smith, spent 10 years researching Van Gogh's life. They had unprecedented access to Van Gogh Museum archives. They employed 8 researchers, 18 translators, and a custom database software to analyze hundreds of thousands of digital note cards of evidence. They ended up with a 900-page biography that won critical acclaim, but it was a 10-page appendix that would blow the case wide open. Let's look at what doesn't add up about the suicide story. So, the problem number 1 is the missing gun. Police searched the wheat field extensively. The gun was never found by the police. Not at the scene, not at Van Gogh's body, not in his room. It wouldn't surface actually until around 1960, 70 years later when a farmer plowed it up from a field. Severely corroded, wooden grips had been rotted away. Problem number 2, no gunpowder burns. This is literally what I would call a smoking gun. In 1890, guns used black powder cartridges, which isn't the clean, smokeless powder we use today. Black powder is extraordinarily messy. It leaves thick soot, powder tattooing, and severe burns on anything close to the barrel. So this is where Dr. Vincent Di Maio, one of the world's leading forensic pathologists, comes into the story. He was the former chief medical examiner of San Antonio, Texas, the expert who examined the bullet wounds of Lee Harvey Oswald and Trayvon Martin. In 2013, Naifeh and Smith brought him the evidence. Di Maio reviewed every available description of Van Gogh's wounds. His conclusion was unequivocally, quote, "Close-range wounds from black powder are extremely dirty. There would have been soot, powder tattooing, and searing of the skin around the entrance. These would have been grossly evident. None of this is described in any accounts of the forensics." End quote. His final opinion, published in the American Journal of Forensic Medicine and Pathology, and I quote, "It is my opinion that, in all medical probability, the wound incurred by Van Gogh was not self-inflicted. In other words, he did not shoot himself." End quote. Problem number 3, the impossible angle. The bullet entered Van Gogh on his left abdomen and traveled at an angle downward, actually, and he was right-handed. To shoot himself this way, he would have had to wrap his arm completely across his body and angle the gun downward and fire with his thumb, most likely, while holding the gun at least 2 feet away from his body to avoid said burn marks. And Dr. Mao concluded the shot had to have been fired from approximately 2 feet away, which would have been beyond the reach of Van Gogh's own arms. Problem number 4, no suicide note. Van Gogh wrote nearly 800 letters that we have in our possession in his lifetime. He documented everything. His struggles, his hopes, his mental state. He was a compulsive documenter. The letter found in his pocket after the shooting, it was an optimistic draft to Theo about his upcoming work. No goodbye, no explanation, no note. Problem number 5, the painting order. So days before his death, Van Gogh ordered fresh supplies from Theo. Paints, brushes, canvas. Why would a suicidal man order all of these materials if he knew that he was never going to use them? And here's what, investigators really think about. His final paintings aren't dark and morbid. They're bursting with life and color. These aren't the works of a man planning his own death. So if Vincent van Gogh didn't shoot himself, who did? Summer 1890. The town Van Gogh was living in, transforms with wealthy Parisians, flood the village. Among them, a family of privilege and status, the Secrétan family. Father was a successful pharmacist with a townhouse in Paris's wealthy 16th kind of district. Two sons, Gaston, who was 19, and René, who was 16. In 1889, Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West show had taken Paris by storm. It was the spectacle of a decade. Cowboys, Indians, sharpshooters, the American frontier really brought to life. 16-year-old René Secrétan became obsessed. He dressed in full cowboy, get up, fringed buckskin, cowboy hat, leather chaps. He strutted through the quiet village of Auvers like he owned it. And he carried a real gun, a small 380 caliber revolver that he borrowed from Gustave Revaux, the innkeeper. He used it to shoot rabbits and birds, to intimidate, really, to impress. There was one problem with the gun. According to René himself, it worked when it wanted. And then there was Vincent van Gogh, the strange man with the mangled ear who painted outside all day, who smelled bad, who dressed like a laborer, who locals called Le Fou, the madman. To René Secrétan and his gang of wealthy friends, Van Gogh was the perfect target. They started small, mockery, laughter, then it escalated. They put hot chili peppers on the tips of his paintbrushes. Knowing that Van Gogh had this weird habit of kind of sucking on the tip of his paintbrushes whenever he was deeply thinking about what he was painting next. And they put a snake in his paint box and Van Gogh nearly fainted. They poured heavy salt in his coffee and they laughed when he spit it out. But the cruelest torment was psychological. They would bring these girls from the Moulin Rouge and they would kiss them and caress them in front of Van Gogh, then encourage the girls to flirt with him to pretend to seduce Van Gogh. Van Gogh knew it wasn't real. He knew they were laughing at him, but he was desperately lonely. He endured it because, the alternative was being completely alone. We know all of this because in 1956, 1957, about 66 years after Van Gogh's death, René Secrétan gave an interview to French physician and writer Victor Dutoit. It was published in the medical journal Escalope in March of 1957. René was 82 years old, dying, and the interview came just months before his death. René described the torment in detail. He admitted to the pranks, the harassment, the cruelty. He even revealed that Van Gogh had sketched him once, like a drawing of a young man in a cowboy hat that had remained unidentified for decades, but turns out it was René. He also said something else, something that, would, make people fixate on it for the next 50 years. And I quote, Van Gogh somehow obtained a gun which had been in the young man's possession, end quote. Not, quote, I heard he got a gun somewhere, Not someone told me he borrowed a gun, nothing like that. Van Gogh obtained the gun, the one that had been in René's possession. And here's what makes this pretty weird of a confession and kind of more damning. Is according to the 2011 biography, police conducted a town-wide inventory of all of the revolvers immediately after the shooting. Guns were pretty rare in this small village, and only one was missing, the one last seen in the possession of René Secrétan. And where was René Secrétan on the night of July 27th, hours after Van Gogh stumbled home bleeding? Well, he was gone, spirited away in the middle of the night by his father. He and his brother Gaston left Auvers immediately, a month before their family normally, departs and goes back to Paris. They fled to the family's villa in Granville on the coast of Normandy, far from Auvers, far from questions, and more importantly, far from consequences. So what actually happened on July 27th of 1890? Based on the forensic evidence, witness accounts, and René's own admissions, here's the theory that I think emerged that most people actually agree with. Late afternoon, Van Gogh is painting in the wheat field, not behind the chateau where the official story says, but possibly near a farmyard on the road called Chapeau Nouveau, where several witnesses reported seeing him. René Secrétan appears, maybe with his brother Gaston, maybe alone. He's drinking. He's definitely emboldened by Buffalo Bill Cody attitude, and he does have his gun. It starts as another taunt, another session of making Le Faux uncomfortable, but something goes terribly, wrong. Maybe Van Gogh fights back this time. Maybe he's finally had enough. Maybe René knocks over his easel, his wet canvas, something. Hours of work destroyed. But René does pull the gun, not to shoot, but to intimidate, to scare Van Gogh, and it's what he always does. But Van Gogh, desperate in a rage or trying to protect himself, probably moved towards René. There's a struggle. René stumbles backwards, and the gun that worked when it wanted decides it wants to work now. The shot enters Van Gogh's abdomen from approximately 2 feet away. The angle is downward. The bullet doesn't hit vital organs, which is why Van Gogh can still walk and get back to the Revo Inn. The kids probably panicked. They're rich kids. They've just shot the crazy artist everyone tolerates, but no one actually cares about Van Gogh, but it's still going to be a thing. They gathered all of Van Gogh's belongings, his easel, his paints, his brushes. They grab the gun and they run. René hurls the gun as far as he can into the wheat field. It buries itself in the soft earth for what is now known to be about 70 years. And Vincent, bleeding and in agony, makes a decision. He makes the decision that he's going to protect these kids. Why? Probably because he knows René is just a stupid kid, and maybe because he knows the Secrétan family is powerful and he is a nobody. Maybe because part of him, as the biographers suggest, actually welcomed death as an escape from his struggle. Or maybe it's simpler than that. Maybe Van Gogh, who spent his life trying to help people who wanted to be, missionaries before he became an artist, who believed in goodness and redemption, maybe he just couldn't bring himself to destroy these young men's lives. So when the police asked, he lied and he said, "I shot myself." When Dr. Gashett asks, he says, "Do not accuse anybody." And when his brother Theo arrives and sits with him through his final hours, Vincent never tells him the truth. He protects his killers to his very last breath. Theo believes it was suicide. Dr. Gashett believed it was suicide. Everyone believed it was suicide because Vincent told them so. And René Secrétan escaped. He goes on to become a successful banker and a businessman, a respected member of society, and he lived to be 83 years old. And then 66 years later, on what is essentially his deathbed, he does finally speak. Not quite a confession, but, close enough. When Naifeh and Smith published their theory in 2011, the art world erupted. The Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam called it speculation. Scholars wrote scathing rebuttals. How dare they challenge the sacred narrative of the tortured artist Van Gogh and his suicide, Art historian Martin Bailey has been one of the most vocal critics. He argues that if René Secrétan had shot Van Gogh, he would have buried the gun deeper or thrown it into the nearby river. Why leave it in a field where it could be found? He points out that every person at Van Gogh's deathbed, his brother, 2 doctors, the innkeeper, the priest, they all believed it was suicide. Why would Vincent lie to everyone, including Theo? But supporters of the murder theory, counter with the argument that the gun was thrown away, exactly as panicked teenagers would do, and Van Gogh lied to everyone precisely because he was protecting the boys as well. What cannot be disputed is the forensic evidence, what Dr. Di Maio's analysis actually stands to say, the bullet trajectory, the lack of powder burns, the angle of entry. And in 2020, a comprehensive forensic study was published by the American Journal of Forensic Medicine and Pathology, in which the conclusion was, in all medical probability, the cause of death is not a self-inflicted gun wound by Vincent van Gogh. And thus, in all medical probability, it is a homicide, end quote. So where does that leave us? Well, it basically leaves us with nothing. Obviously, there's no definitive proof, and we didn't get the deathbed confession, and we're not left with any DNA evidence. But what we have is reasonable doubt. Forensic evidence that contradicts suicide, a history of bullying and harassment, a missing gun that appears exactly where a frightened teenager might throw it, and a dying man's carefully worded admission that he, quote-unquote, knew where Van Gogh got the gun. Vincent van Gogh is buried in the cemetery at Auvers-sur-Oise. Next to him, his brother Theo, who died 6 months later from grief and syphilis. Their graves are covered in sunflowers left by visitors from around the world. The room where Vincent died remains exactly as it was. small, simple, and a window overlooking a wheat fields. And in that town, a secret might still be buried, a truth protected by a dying artist's final lie. So, was Vincent van Gogh's greatest masterpiece his art, or was it that he, in his final acts of mercy, taking the blame to save two reckless teenagers from a lifetime of guilt? History calls it suicide, forensic calls it homicide, but maybe the question isn't how Vincent van Gogh died, it's why he chose to protect his likely killers. Thanks for tuning in this week. We have plenty more episodes of Art History Mysteries that are released every Tuesday, Texas History Mysteries on every Thursday. Leave a comment, let me know. Do you think Van Gogh was covering up his own murder, protecting the teenage boys? I don't know. I probably believe that he was indeed covering up he was protecting the boys. I think he probably was. I think he thought he had a very rough life. And if you read some of the letters that he wrote to his brother, it actually shows how kind of miserable he was for most of his life. And he was stricken with poverty. So seeing a couple rich kids who kind of had everything, he probably saw it as somewhat of a good life. And he probably just didn't want to take that away from them. He was known to be friends with Gaston. And so, I don't know. It's interesting, but leave a comment. Let me know what you think. If you like this video, tune in for more. We have some really interesting, cool, fun stories coming up. So, all right. See you in the next one.
Oh yeah, I know this one. I know this one.